Hello, everyone. This is going to be a talk about tabletop game design. As the talk goes on, if anything comes up, just type it in the chat window. I'll try to keep that in my line of vision and interrupt me with questions as they come up, and I'll either take care of them right then or we'll cover them at the end. So today I am going to talk about how tabletop game design has changed this year given current events. My name is Jonathan Chaffer. For the purposes of the talk today, we'll say that I am a tabletop game designer. This is not my day job, but I have some games out on the market, in the hobby market. For people who I don't know the makeup of our crowd today, it's usually a little easier in person to get these kinds of straw polls to figure out where people are coming from. But if you are not a board and card game player these days, you may not know that there are basically two different markets. There is a mainstream kind of big box store board game, card game market for games like your old Yahtzee and Sorry and Monopoly, those kinds of things. And then there's a hobby market that is more sometimes called designer games, which came out of the a European game design movement in the mid 90s and has grown in popularity, but is still a fraction of what the retail mainstream market is. So I'm talking about that smaller market today. So first, I want to talk about how the fact that we are physically isolated has changed tabletop gaming in general in the hobby market. The first thing is that families are bored, and this has had actually a very positive impact on the non-hobby market, especially, and even in the hobby market, the more mainstream or more well-known titles. I was seeing a statistic recently that the board game Settlers of Catan has seen its sales more than double over last year. And of course, it's being attributed to people, families, spending more time indoors and trying to figure out what to do with their spare time. And so this has seen industry-wide a boom in family weight, lighter games that don't have as many rules to them and that already have some popularity. Those are booming. On the other hand, hobby gamers tend to thrive on larger gatherings, conventions, and gatherings in other friends' houses, and those have dried right up. So while we're seeing a boom in the most well-known titles and the simpler titles, we're also seeing a sales decline in more complex games and in niche titles. So what are people doing to get around this? People who enjoy hobby games are trying a bunch of things to keep their hobby going. So some people are using existing video tools like Zoom to play board games and card games remotely. Our weekly game group handles this with having a second camera pointing down to a table and one person going through the motions and other people saying what they want to do. This works pretty well for more games than you think it would. There are some qualities to games that make them amenable to this type of delivery, like no hidden information is a big one. And just the amount of physical space it takes is another big factor. Or there are people who have turned to bespoke digital implementations of board games, which can be very nice. The number of games that are implemented this way is somewhat limited, and there is often a cost factor, especially when you factor in that these are on a variety of different platforms, which might require purchasing a console, or if you don't have the same kinds of equipment as your friends, maybe you're not all on Steam, or maybe you're not all on Nintendo Switch, or whatever it is that you're playing on, and that can be a roadblock. The flip side of that is that the interfaces can be tailored toward making the experience very nice. So with those options, that's great for playing games, but now I want to pivot toward the side of the hobby that I am more involved in, which is the game design part. When you are designing a board game or card game, the most important portion of that process is playtesting. And that means as soon as you have something on paper, you want to get it in front of people. And that can start with yourself, but pretty quickly needs to be people other than yourself. And obviously that poses some challenges. So this is a photo of our local design group, the Grand Rapids Unpublished Board Game Society, Grubs, from a couple of years back, and what a typical meeting looks like. A bunch of people around a couple tables, pushing around what someone has put together for us to try out and discuss and make better. And this is what a meeting looks like this week. So we are now just discussing things on a Discord for that purpose, and testing this way. Of course, on the other end of the spectrum, there are large gatherings. So this is an example of a protospiel in process, which is much like our weekly gatherings, but is many more people who drive from farther. So this is the Chicago protospiel from a couple years back. These events tend to get between 100 and 150 people who come together in a room and divide up into groups and play each other's games and give feedback and make things better. This year, this is what Protospiel looks like. So once again, a bunch of people on a Discord talking. So how does this even work? Well, we need to figure out a way to prototype things so that we can do them in these virtual formats. Now, traditionally, the best way to prototype a tabletop game is to put as little effort into it as you possibly can. And the reason for this is that it is a common failing, especially of newer designers, to love your idea so much and pour so much effort into it that you are unwilling to change it. And this is something that almost I would be so bold as to say every designer has to break themselves of this desire that with their first or second design. It seems like the best thing you've ever heard before because you thought of it and it is special. And one tool that you have to stop yourself from getting into that trap is to make your prototype not that pretty, so that you are willing to accept feedback, iterate, and improve. So at our meetups, you will see a lot of things that are as simple as someone has taken some index cards and written some things on them, just getting enough to push things around for that first play. Now, we can't do that. So if we can't physically write on cards and do a play test, if we're doing things remotely, what can we do? Well, we could write a digital implementation of a board game. The problem with this is it swings us hard in the other direction because the overhead involved in getting something that is even playable is so much that you can't really do any rapid prototyping. You have invested too much in the way the game works to have a reasonable playtest. So the challenge is, how can we find a middle ground between these two? The answer for most designers these days is simulation software. So this is an example. The screenshot is from a game, a piece of software called Tabletop Simulator. There are competitors in that market. Tabletopia is one of the other big ones, or ScreenTop. The idea behind these is that instead of trying to make a digital implementation of a game, which is a set of rules that a digitized version of the rules of the game, with the computer being the rule book for you and allowing you to go through the actions of a turn and it responding appropriately. Instead of that, it says, well, I'm not going to care what the rules of the game are. I'm just going to let you put in a virtual space, make a card, make a token, and push them around and allow players to enforce the rules just as they would in real life. This turns out to be a phenomenally bad idea if what you want to do is play a board game. Because it is just not as good of an experience as software that is designed for a game and will enforce the rules for you. However, for prototyping, it is exactly what we need because it allows us not to worry. It allows us in real time, as we're playtesting something, to change our mind and say, let's make the rules slightly different. And we don't have to change anything. We just behave differently as humans, which is exactly what we want. So as an illustration of that, Tabletop Simulator comes with a few basic games like Go here, and we can drag things around and put them in place, but we can break the rules and the same player can go twice in a row or 3 times in a row, or they can just throw the pieces around everywhere. There's absolutely no constraint on the actual logic of the game going on. However, in order to enable that, the software is extremely complicated. Tabletop Simulator is probably the worst offender in its genre of this, and yet it is the dominant force. It is clearly designed by people who are used to playing first-person shooters or StarCraft or various things that require a huge number of key bindings that you have to memorize. And getting the barrier to entry is very high. Also, in order to allow for the flexibility of being able to play any game in this scenario, it makes some assumptions. Like when you're going to put a card on top of another card, they should form a deck, which is sometimes unfortunate because I wanted to put that 5 on that 6. And now when I grab the 5, I get the 5 and the 6. So I need to know how to click and drag real fast on that 5 to separate it from the 6. And so this these assumptions can sometimes get in our way. It is often described that playing a game in Tabletop Simulator is like playing a board game with boxing gloves on. Um, you you just feel like everything you do is just a little bit clumsier than in real life, and we find that it is pretty reliable that if you're trying to estimate how long the game you're designing actually takes to play, you should assume that Tabletop Simulator has doubled the length of a game, and that is pretty reliable compared to real life. Um, you can also see where the design of Tabletop Simulator has come from, because they are so proud of their physics simulation that they have 8 major buttons in their user interface, and they have dedicated a full 1/8 of their user interface to a button that allows you to flip over the table, which it makes for a nice demo. But when your simulation isn't even good enough to render the bottom of the table and you see right through it when you flips it, you wonder why they're so proud of that. Um, so there are a lot of quirks that we have to deal with. However, all that said, it is the best tool that we have for the needs of prototyping. You can get fancier with it, and you can make things nicer. This is one of my prototypes that I've spent more time on. You can do things like when you drag a card into a place, make it snap into the right orientation and position. You can do things like, I've got a button down here that refilled this row appropriately. However, to make that happen, I had to write a boatload of scripting, and I had to learn Lua, which was not on my bucket list. But you can bend it to your will and make the experience a little better. But kind of the question is, what is the breaking point? At some point, if the game is polished enough that it's not changing, is it really worth making it nicer in Tabletop Simulator as opposed to something that is actually a digital implementation of your game? You're going to make that pivot at some point. The other things that you will have to wrestle with when playtesting in a remote environment, a big thing that isn't immediately clear is that one of the most important pieces of feedback you get as a designer when doing a playtest is nonverbal cues. You can tell when someone has zoned out, when they're just not engaged. In fact, playtesters will often tell me that they enjoyed a game, and I can tell that they did not, and they're being polite. And you can, when observing players, often figure out exactly what is where the pain points are in your game just by observing people reacting, and they may not even consciously know what it is that they are stumbling across. So one of the ramifications of that is that testing with the general public is less useful in a virtual setting, and testing with other designers is more useful because those are people who have had to wrestle with this same problem. And that is always a valuable kind of playtest in regular physical environments, but it's even more important in a virtual environment. So there are all these things getting in the way, but there are upsides to it as well. Um, this is a map of um, the number of attendees in various locations that attended Protospiel Chicago this year. Instead of having to drive there, you were just getting on a Discord server and joining. And so we got people from around the world to help. So the broad appeal, or the broad accessibility of these events means that you can get your games tested by a much a much more varied audience than you could otherwise. So that's definitely an upside to the situation. Of course, to wrangle that number of people, you need some solutions as well, which are just negotiated normally in person by walking up to a table and sitting down. There is a remote playtesting group that is organized out of New York, but is international now, that meets every Tuesday night and every Saturday afternoon, and gets reliably 40 to 50 people at every session testing. And in order to handle that, they have developed a lot of procedures. This is the Google sheet that they use to figure out who's going to be testing which game at which time. And they've got a great moderation staff that is dedicated to getting people in the right room at the right time and getting people going on Tabletop Simulator. So there's a lot of bureaucracy that's required that wouldn't be required in person. So that's kind of the state of affairs now with playtesting. Now I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the story after a game has been completed in the designer's mind and how that has changed this year. The first thing, the first step after you have effectively finished your game is the pitch. You need to get your game in front of some publishers so that you can get a publication contract and move on to the next steps. This traditionally is done at those big conventions where you'll set up meetings and have a pitch meeting. And obviously that's not happening these days. So there are a couple ramifications of that. One is that simply fewer games are being published from the economic reasons. Another is that it's even more important than it used to be to have some actual relationships. A game that I have that's coming out later this year is being published because I already had a relationship with the publisher and was able to have that conversation, get that introduction, which is a problem when you're trying to break in. Some publishers are making some more open calls for video meetings, or they're having more contest type submissions where they will try to get their eyes on some new talent by running some sort of design contest. When you've got that, then the next steps are actually not much changed. There's the development process with the publisher, which is subject to the same constraints as the playtesting when you're in the design phase. That was already fairly remote, so that hasn't changed very much. Similarly, the art and graphic design process is fairly similar. That'll still be outsourced to an artist. And then you get to the manufacturing, which still is largely in China. Even though there are some economic uncertainties there, that's still where most of the manufacturing is happening, and that process has changed much less than you think it would have. One last thing on this topic, and I'll get to a couple of questions that have come in. Then we got to the sales part of the process, which again, in the hobby market, was driven mostly by conventions. That's how the word got out. That's how things got into the game media. And with those dried up, people are relying a lot more on direct communication with gaming journalists, which really in the hobby market is less formal than it is with digital games. We're talking about, the Dice Tower and Shut Up and Sit Down and Board Game Geek and some of those bigger outlets. So publishers already have relationships with those people and are contacting them directly. So the question in the chat in terms of whether it makes sense to hold a game until later, I think that some publishers are making that decision to release fewer this year. I think as a designer, my motivation is get in front of a publisher now, because the ramification isn't that I shouldn't pitch it to a publisher now. It's that I need to pitch it to a publisher now, so I'm in their queue for when they start ramping back up. Then the last thing I want to talk about, and then if there's, I haven't looked at whether the grid has filled up at all. I don't think it has, so I can answer questions as long as need to. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I predict the lasting impacts are going to be about this year. I think we're going to see some permanent changes because of, even if everything were to return to quote normal in terms of our health, the health aspects of things, I think we're going to see some changes because of this. One is that I think our friendly local game stores are getting hit very hard right now, with people not wanting to play in their space, and people still wanting to play games but not really finding a reason to go and browse in a physical store. Online retail is booming, and this is, if anything, more true in this market than others. So I think we're going to see a lot of physical retail for board games go away and not come back as strong as it was. I think we're going to see Asmodee, which is the largest publisher and in the last 10 years has gobbled up all of the mid-sized publishers, become even more dominant, and smaller publishers just don't have the war chest to be able to weather the storm like Asmodee does. So I think we'll see a lot of smaller publishers go out of business, and probably a bunch of small publishers start up that we haven't heard of before in the next couple years once things solidify. We're going to see a phase where publishers are not willing to take risks. So you're going to see a lot of licensed IPs, and you're going to see a lot of sequels and expansions to existing games, because those are safer bets than newer IPs and more innovative games over the short term. We're going to see people embrace the fact that they can easily play test virtually, even though there are all those drawbacks. I think we're going to see that as a side-by-side method of game design, and that will continue. I think we're going to see online conventions not be that big of a deal, because people are not finding those satisfying. But as far as the game design goes, I think that will continue. And we're going to see the pace of game development increase. The amount of time it takes from idea to pitching is going way down, because it's so easy to find people to test and iterate with. I used to basically make some changes and wait 2 weeks until the next bi-weekly meeting of our local group to test things. Now I have 3 reliable opportunities to play test with people locally and remotely every week. So iteration is much faster than it was before. And that's what I had prepared earlier today. So I'll go over to any questions that people have. I see a couple in the channel, so, and feel free to unmute and ask as well. Patrick, recommendations for how to get started. The first thing is that we have a great community locally here in Grand Rapids, of a dozen or two designers that range from people who have published games to people who are just thinking about maybe doing it someday, um, who now are meeting on Discord every week, every Thursday night. And a great way to start is to join some playtests and hear the conversation, because people are talking about the same problems and opportunities for improvement and praising things over and over again. So you learn pretty quickly some traps. They're playing a lot of games is obviously also very useful, understanding the market. One thing is that the considerations are very different if you are, depending on what you're developing a board game for. Are you trying to sell it in the mass market? Are you trying to sell it in the hobby market? Are you trying to kickstart it yourself? Are you not trying to sell it at all? Are you just making it for fun? Those are all viable, and there are different ramifications to that. And our group uh, is pretty good about asking those questions and understanding the goal and giving the appropriate advice. One thing we push really hard is that feedback shouldn't be about making the playtester happy with the game. It should be about making the game the best version of what the game is trying to be. And if that is something for you to play with your friends, that is wonderful. And then we need to understand what your friends want to play and make it that. If it's, I want to make a lot of money with this, well, then you're talking about the mass market, and the considerations are way different than the hobby market, is which is what you do when you don't want to make any money, but you want to make something you're proud of. So you decide what your goal is, and a lot of things are going to be tailored to that. So if you want more information about hooking up with us, please DM me, and I'll be happy to share that, or maybe I'll just type it in the chat here. Yeah. I hear someone else. Question? Oh, no. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? I guess that's it. So yeah, I don't think there's another talk scheduled. Oh, there is right now. Right now at 8, there's a talk in Creative Corner. But for people who are not going there and have more questions for me, I'm just going to hang out here for a few more minutes. Thank you.